The reason for this statement, the leader, the teacher, is my belief that all leaders should seek to be teachers. In this sense, you seek to make the people who you work with and the people who are working under you the best they can possibly be. And that is the fundamental responsibility of the leader in any organization he works with. And to me, that is really the honorable purpose of the teacher. Do the best that you can for each kid. And so I believe the leader also should be seeing things that way. Too many people who are running organizations look at the people they have as kind of these are their toy soldiers to be moved around to fulfill their vision as a leader. My perspective is a different one. My perspective is the leader is in that very great position of privilege to be able to discover what is it that moves the people under them and that moves the people that they work with. What is it that gives them a sense of purpose, a sense of worthiness in what they are doing? And to create a framework, to create a work environment which gives them the maximum possibility to realize what they believe is a good, sensible, purposeful thing to be doing. That's a challenge. It's not necessarily easy, but it's a frame of mind. It is a frame of mind which says the leader looks out to see as his prime responsibility about creating the conditions so that the people can get on to do their job the best way they possibly can. And in the process, they build up their self-confidence. In the process, they build up their capabilities to do the job. Don't need to worry. They join the company or they join the institution in order to fulfill the purpose of the institution. But by doing this, what we are doing is multiplying the possibilities, multiplying the achievement of the institution, because it's no longer dependent on the guy on top having this idea and getting all the fellows to say, you just do this, my one idea. What you are doing is to say, it's not just people working to fulfill that one idea you may have, but if each of them have their own one idea, every one of them will be doing something new, something different, something extra, and at the end of the year, you achieve a lot more than what your one idea could have achieved. This is the basic idea behind the book. There's a subtext to this title. It says, the leader, the teacher, and you, and it says, leadership through the third generation. The idea behind that was, as you know, the Chinese have a saying which says, wealth doesn't last more than 3 generations. Right? It says the first generation creates the wealth, the second generation maintains the wealth, the third generation squanders the wealth. I've always been puzzled by that, until one professor in Hong Kong, he explained to me this way, which I thought was quite interesting. He says, you need to understand that the second generation is a generation of siblings. They've been brought up in the same household. They may have their differences of views. By the end of the day, they have more or less the same value systems. They have more or less the same attitudes towards life. So despite all the quarrels and so forth, they can kind of agree on which way to go forward. And then he says, you need to understand the third generation is a generation of cousins. And in the generation of cousins, they have been brought up in different households. Each household have their own set of values. Each household have their own attitudes towards life, have their own life principles. And you shouldn't be surprised if the name of the game became, how much of the wealth can you consume before the other guy consumes it? I think when you think about it as a country, it's not very much different as an idea. That what you have, when you don't feel yourself as part of the same household and united by a common set of principles, a way of thinking and so forth, what you end up is each one taking maximum advantage they can. And very often is take as much as you can, as fast as you can, because if you don't, the other guy is going to take it, and that doesn't seem very smart. But basically, organizations as countries need to think through a better way. The whole idea of saying leadership through the third generation is really this idea. The first generation will be the successful generation, obviously so. The second generation leaders are normally brought up through an apprenticeship approach. You look around and say, who could possibly be the next group of leaders? And so the first generation will take them in, make them sit in meetings, give them projects, give them opportunities to make themselves known in the company, give them opportunities to be seen as the new leadership coming through who is competent, who can be relied on for the future, and then at an appropriate time, the first generation retires and the second generation comes in. The second generation, having been brought in through an apprenticeship approach, now comes to a point where they have to pass the third generation. I think the disaster comes when you pass from second to third generation through the process of apprenticeship. Every generation needs to solve its own problems. All of you who are parents will know that. You may try as hard as you can to try to make life convenient and comfortable for your children and try to anticipate their problems and create conditions so that they don't need to face the problems, as a result of which they never face the problems, they never develop their own experience, so they don't have the capacity to solve the problems themselves later on. But every generation, any organization, and even for countries, every generation of leaders needs to solve the problems of their generation. It's a different demographics, it's a different set of social values, and they have to solve it their own way. Passing from first to second generation means the second generation doesn't make use of everything they learned from first generation, because the problem that they face is not exactly the same as for the first generation. If you assume, let's say that 60% of what the second generation leaders learned from first generation is something they could use, and 40% is something they couldn't use because they are not faced with the same situation. If they do the same thing, passing from second generation to third generation, what are we saying? Suppose the third generation again can make use of only 60% of what they learned from the second generation. It means the third generation ends up using only 36% of the experience and the wisdom of the first generation. The rate at which you lose wisdom and judgment and knowledge is extremely fast. So the idea behind the book was to say that the first generation, having gone through the success, needs to codify their values and their principles. That's not to say that the second generation has to make use of all of it, but it is to say that the second generation can then have access to the values, the wisdom, the judgment, the history, the experience of the first generation, which they could do through an apprenticeship program, but now if you codify it, it is something they can refer to. But the particular value actually lies with the third generation. The third generation now has access, because it's codified, has access to the wisdom and the knowledge and the experiences of the first generation. So that is a fundamental proposition behind the book, that organizations need to codify their reasons for success, because this is necessary for the future generations to be able to learn from. I hope I've spoken enough as to why the book was written, but mostly it is as a record. It is an attempt, as I said, because documentation, I can show you documentation in the government in Singapore in terms of what the problems are and why we are doing it this way and so forth, in many instances actually is lacking, simply because geography did not demand for us to do it. This book is an attempt to try to fill some of those gaps, and that's why fundamentally it is a book which should be of interest. It is about leadership and governance. It is of interest generally about leadership, whether it is leadership in families, leadership in companies, leadership in countries, leadership in any organization, and I hope people find it useful. What I've said just now about passing these principles and values down to the third generation and subsequent generations, to me applies very much to what you see happening these days on SG50. We are celebrating 50 years of independence. To me, the critical thing is, what of the last 50 years are we learning for the next 50 years? And that's a lot more important than simply say, I'm so happy that we have lived 50 years. The question is, what of the wisdom are you taking into the future? I'll share some of my thoughts on that with you. But to me, that really has to be the most important thing about SG50. Just a quotation from some people. This is Jack Ma, Alibaba. He says, no matter how successful you are in your career, you must always remember that we are here to live. If you keep yourself busy working, you'll surely regret it. Okay, for those of you who think that you're not having enough rest, just working all the time, because your boss is like, just remember, he said, we are here to live. And therefore, you have to make your work part of your life. You have to make your work a worthy part of your living. That's how we live, okay? He also said, I always tell myself that we are born here not to work but to enjoy life. We are here to make things better for one another and not to work. I met him, I discussed him once, and when he talked about Alibaba, it's quite remarkable. I say, he never talks about figures, he never talks about profits, he never talks about beating a competition. All he talks about is, I'm creating jobs, I'm making work meaningful for my people, I'm serving the community with services which is useful for the general public. That's the way he talks. So he says, make things better for one another. I'm sure all of you would have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, you think about the 5, right? The 5 that you normally have. You have the physiological, needs. You need air, water, food, and so forth, right? Then you go on. Then you go on from there. You say you have security and safety needs. Then you have love needs. Love needs. You need to have this feeling that people love and care for you. You have esteem needs. You need to feel good about yourself. And finally, you have self-actualization. Everybody remembers about self-actualization. Now, later research actually shows that the number of needs we have is actually 8 and not 5. The 3 additional ones we need are cognitive, a need to understand, and next is aesthetic, a need for beauty in our lives. And the final one is transcendence. Transcendence says it's beyond yourself. So if self-actualization means to realize your potential, your own potential, transcendence means to help other people realize their potential. In the final list, the hierarchy of needs actually goes from physiological to security to love to esteem. Then you come to need for the cognitive need for understanding, a need for beauty, aesthetic in life, then self-actualization, then transcendence. The highest need of all is transcendence. For so many people, actually the greatest happiness that we feel, the greatest sense of having done something really good is when we give happiness to other people, when we feel that we are useful to other people. Is this sense about doing something for the life of another human being which gives you the greatest sense of achievement. It is not about self-actualization. Everything in Maslow's hierarchy is totally selfish. It's just about yourself. And yet the discovery that the greatest thing you can do for your own life actually lies in doing something good for other people. As you know, the first 4 needs are really described as the gap needs. These are things where you're really miserable as a person if you don't have it. The last 4 needs, which is needs about understanding, about aesthetics, about self-actualization and transcendence, are the growth needs. You really stultified as a person if you don't have it. So that's just a proposition. It's in the books. It's in my book, so you can go read it too. How many of you have read Steve Jobs' biography? Well, anyway, the book is about 4.5 centimeters thick. I must tell you this, having read through the whole book, to me, the most important message, the most important takeaway for me was this quotation, and this quotation was to be found on page 3 of the book. It's a blank page with only this quotation there. He says, the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. But I just put it to you, this is terribly interesting. Are we going to be people who are crazy enough to think we can change the world? Because if you are not going to change anything. And yet, if we are going to do something good around us, to change what is happening around us for the good of people around us, this is it. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. give you one more quotation from Steve Jobs, quite interesting. He says, being the richest man in the cemetery doesn't matter to me. Going to bed at night saying we've done something wonderful, that's what matters to me. The question is, what is each of us doing to discover this for our own life? It's quite an interesting thing. There's the thing called the Bata story. Now, the point of the story is this. The founder of Bata noticed that they were hardly selling any shoes in Africa. So he sent his strategy guy, said, go to Africa, go study the market for me. The chap came back to him and said, there's no hope. There's no hope for Bata in Africa. They don't wear shoes. And for the founder of Bata, he says, wow, we got such enormous opportunity in Bata. It's how you see. So the question is whether we are going to be people who see opportunity, or whether we people who simply say, this is the way the world is, we live with the world as it is, and that's that. That's the Bata story, okay? Okay, I'd like to talk about this in the sense of, just to follow through on the SG50 idea, to sort of say, what can we learn? And I put this grid to you as a way, at least as my way of understanding what is going on in Singapore. And we have to address the question of what good can we do, what good can we dream of for Singapore, because that, at the end of the day, since I do not know any of your backgrounds, the only thing that ties us together, except for a few of our friends there who are non-Singaporeans, the rest of you are Singaporeans, that's what ties us together, and that's the conversation for the evening. I put it to you this way. I call it the wealth attitude grid, okay? The y-axis is the wealth level that goes from poor to rich, wealth level of the country, and the x-axis is the life attitude of the people in the country, whether it's poor to rich. The life attitude of the poor is one of, I never know when the next meal is going to come. I never know when the next order is going to come. Better spend carefully. What happens if there's a rainy day? You can worry yourself crazy. But anyway, that's life attitude for the poor. Life attitude for the rich is, we've got it, not to worry, we can spend it. Where are we today? When we started in Singapore, obviously we are in the bottom left quadrant, point A, right? The wealth level of the country is poor. The life attitude has to be poor. There's no other way it could be. What happens over a period of time is that the wealth level of the country has gone up. But the people's perception, I think, the people's perception of the government is that today we are in the top left quadrant, in B, perception of the government, that the wealth level of the country has gone up, but the attitude of the government towards life is still of a poor man. Careful on what you spend, save as much as you can, right? Okay. Perceived to be stingy, perceived to be, unresponsive, whatever it is. So that's where people perceive the government in Singapore to be, top left quadrant. Where do the people want to be? Where the people want to be is in the top right quadrant. They say the wealth level of country is up there rich, then how come our left attitude is not rich? To me, that is the fundamental difference that we are seeing. Every time there's this argument, people are unhappy with the government or people are unhappy with Singapore. Just, of course, this is oversimplified, but to me, the explanation lies in this difference. That people perceive the government to be at B and people want to be at C. What's the government's concern? The government's concern is that if Singapore ever were in the bottom right quadrant, if we ever were at D, we're in deep trouble. We wouldn't know how to get out of the mess. So the government wants to make sure Singapore is never at D. Question, are there countries in the bottom right quadrant? What countries are in the bottom right quadrant? Sorry? The European countries are in bottom right quadrant. Anyone else? If you analyze very carefully, probably Japan is in the bottom right quadrant. And if you analyze it very carefully, probably the US is in the bottom right quadrant. What is happening in these countries? And the reason you're not seeing it in the figures, unlike Europe, where it really has come to the fore, and therefore, it rises above the surface, you can see it and you say it's Europe, is the pay-as-you-go system. So if you owe pension to your people, you've done a pay-as-you-go system, which means to say you collect from the people who are still working today and pay the pensioners whatever you owe them as pension. Same with the social security system. Well, if you have a system which is totally dependent on people who are working, providing contributions to those who have retired, then rather than have a fully funded pension system or fully funded social security system, you are living completely on the basis of assuming everything is going to be okay, and you're continually going to have people who are contributing who will pay for the people who are retired. But of course, if you now have a situation where people are not producing enough children and you don't want to have any other people coming in, you have to solve the problem. And that is a fundamental problem all the governments around the world are trying to address. But actually, they're not trying to address it. They're just trying to avoid it and hope people don't think about it. The reason I put that grid up is just to make the point that I think this is where the fundamental difference is. People perceive the government to be in the top left quadrant. People want to be in the top right quadrant. The government is fearful of us ending up in the bottom right quadrant. And so sometimes people suspect that the way the government tries very hard to make sure we are not in the bottom right quadrant is to keep running the country in the top left quadrant. And so you continually have this difference. The real question for us is this: if the wealth level of the country is high, why can't we be in the top right quadrant? Logically, you should get into the top right quadrant, which perhaps then will lead us to what, to my mind, are the really critical questions we have to address if we're talking about Singapore in the next 50 years. Which is, we want to be in the top right quadrant. We can be in the top right quadrant, provided we answer two questions. The first question is, how do we maintain the wealth level? How do you keep earning stuff to maintain the wealth level? And second, what is our attitude towards spending? What attitude should we have towards spending in order to make the spending such that you can maintain the wealth level there, rather than people get used to the rich man's way of living, and when the country runs out of the capacity to continue to fund this, as has happened in Europe, you borrow money to be able to maintain that. Rather than say, we either have to increase the taxes or say we have to cut back on social security, you keep maintaining that, now you borrow money. And when you borrow money, you're in the bottom right quadrant. So how do you prevent that? So I think fundamentally these are the questions that really have to be answered. What economic policies does Singapore need to keep the wealth level up? And second, what social policies does Singapore need to keep spending expectations within sustainable limits? I believe if we can have sensible answers to both these questions, you can be in the top right quadrant and continue to be there. To me, the most fundamental of all questions is, what are we thinking about life, and are we thinking about the generations to come, or are we concerned only with our life today? If you are, that's why I put it as, what will we leave to our grandchildren? If you are concerned enough about the grandchildren, then you say, that's the basis upon which I will decide my answers to these two other questions. The kinds of economic policies we should adopt, the kinds of social policies we should adopt. And my answers as to whether this is good policy or not good policy is dependent on whether I can say this is good for my grandchildren because it will leave the country in a good state for my grandchildren. If the policies we're talking about does not leave us in a good state, then you have to seriously question why you want to adopt that policy. So that's the proposition I'm really leaving. I'm not giving an answer, I'm just posing the problem, which is that if you have to learn anything like SG50, you have to answer the question, the next 50 years must see us going in the top right quadrant. But what do we need to think, and how do we need to think, and what do we need to do to make sure that even as we enter the top right quadrant, we don't end up in the bottom right quadrant? It's not an easy dialogue to be taking, but I believe it can be done. I'll have to rush through the rest of my slides, otherwise there will be no opportunity for you to be asking the questions, and at the end of the day is really what interests you, which really should matter. But let me run through this. First one about little red dot. I'm sure many of you would have heard about little red dot. The whole expression little red dot came from President Habibie, who took over from President Suharto in 1998. Right, and he was just saying that what is there about Singapore is just a little red dot in the sea of green. If you think of an atlas of the world, in an atlas of the world, Singapore fits quite nicely within the letter O of the name of the country. In fact, in most atlases of the world, they have to expand that circle of Singapore so that you know exactly where to find it. So most representations of the circles that say this is Singapore is larger than what we actually are. You all know that. The question is, how much do we realize, and how much in particular do the younger generation today and the generations to come, how much do they understand the meaning of smallness? In the world as we find it, if you succeed, people will pay attention to you. If you fail, nobody is going to care. That's it. You can say, unfortunately, that is the case, but it is the case. At the end of the day, all politics, all foreign policy is domestic. Whether President Obama says he doesn't want boots on the ground in Iraq again, that foreign policy is dictated by domestic considerations. So at the end of the day, that's all that foreign policy is. So what does smallness mean for Singapore? I think this is something we need to share with newer generations coming through. It is not to prevent Singapore from entering into that top right quadrant. It is to understand that countries must succeed in order to count. If you don't succeed, that's that. For small countries, success and survival are two sides of the same coin. It is not the same for a big country. A country like China can decide that the coastal cities can go ahead and get wealthy first, and then we distribute the wealth, and then we can develop the center of China and the western regions. In a place like Singapore, you can't solve the problem that way. Survival and success are two sides of the same coin. They go together. So the challenge for Singapore is what you need to succeed. The point about the little red dot is to think back about Singapore and say what fundamentally has made Singapore succeed. Yes, we got good education policy, we got good economic policy, all these things are terribly important. But when you think fundamentally about the brand image of Singapore, what does Singapore stand for? And I think you come to a conclusion that the brand image of Singapore, which has allowed us to succeed in many ways, is about trustworthiness, reliability, dependability, quality consciousness, a drive for excellence, honoring your word. If we fail to understand that the most important lesson from SG50 is to be people who honor our word, we're in trouble. We are a high-cost economy. How do high-cost economies continue to succeed? People hope for high wages. How do countries succeed to continue to maintain high wages? I think a country we ought to look at, for example, is Switzerland. Switzerland is a high-cost country. It's the highest cost country in the whole of Europe. It's got the highest wages in the whole of Europe. But what makes Switzerland Switzerland? Fundamentally, it is about quality, reliability. It's a whole brand. People call up, and they know that that's the quality you're going to get. If what is delivered to you is not what you ordered, you know they're going to replace it, they're going to repair it. That's the way it is. Are we that kind of a place? And do we recognize that that is the kind of place we need to be in order to continue to be a high-cost, high-wage economy? And this is total, is attitudes of people, right? That fundamentally to me, the little red dot story. Singapore, I think in many ways, is a testament to human enterprise and imagination. Because we are small and so different, we cannot just be following what other people are doing. We have to think for ourselves, learn from everywhere, but think for ourselves, come up with our own solutions. My 37 years of work in the civil service, when people have asked me what place I found most interesting, I must tell you the most interesting place to me has always been the Ministry of Defense. It's the one place where you're confronted with just one fundamental issue, which is only Singaporeans can work the place. And you say, you have to figure it out yourself. You learn from everywhere. Take advisors, take consultants. You can sign all these contracts with people. By the end of the day, what are you doing about saying this is something I need to fix myself? And maybe there should be more places in Singapore, more areas in Singapore where Singaporeans take the attitude of, hello, this is not for something to deliver to me. What am I doing to deliver what needs to be delivered? What am I doing about creating that future? And not to be limited fundamental in our imagination. I think if you look at Singapore, whether you talk about Bird Park, you talk about the various institutions in Singapore, if you do not have the imagination, you just go into say, looking at how other countries are, you're never going to do it in Singapore. I think we need that spirit to be revived in Singapore. I think people have to go out and they need to exercise their imagination. I like a quotation of Einstein who says, logic will take you from point A to point B, imagination will take you everywhere. He also says imagination is more important than knowledge. But most remarkably, he says the essence of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination. You know, Einstein made a point of saying, you know, if he needs to insult your intelligence, he would. But let's get clear, that's about imagination. I just want to show this, and then I want to run through and close it off.
Are here with the executive chairman and co-founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a whirlwind, 15 years to the New York Stock Exchange. How do you feel?
I feel excited and honored, and I think team are very humble, and very important is that it's a great blessing from the world, and we are so excited by the trust we've got today.
Well, that's actually something I want to talk to you about is trust. You know, American investors are concerned about the structure of the company, the governing structure, the transparency of the Chinese government. Why should they be concerned or not concerned?
I think the concerning I understand. When you read so many newspaper reporter about what's happening in China, definitely. But if you really walk there, if you stay there, live there, and finding out that's not things too bad. As I said, 15 years ago, a lot of people say, how can you survive in China? Without having money, without having a government relationship, and without that. We say, we work from heart. We believe only when you trust the people, only your people trust you, only the government trust you, only the customer trust you, shareholder trust you, and then we can survive. And I think a lot of things people worry about, we understand. And they will see, we will prove it.
Well, obviously you've proved it in China very well, but how often do you talk to the Chinese government? What do they say to you, and how often do you listen to them?
I listen to them carefully because this is a job as a business leader. If you really want to help the society, you have to work with the government. Everywhere, not only China government, every government every country I go, I try to. In the past 15 years, I took this as a great opportunity to talk to the government, listen to their worries, solve their problems. We have the same thing, create jobs, that's what we want. And pump up the domestic demanding, and this is all the things we want to do and the government want to solve. And very important is that internet isn't so new to any government. So if you can tell them what you are doing, and if you listen what they worry about, then you can find a way. This is why we're doing business.
Okay, let me stop there. Just the emphasis on word trust, follow through from what I'm talking about previously. What's the most important thing for us to learn? in SG50 about our last 50 years. I think it's fundamentally about trust or trustworthiness. It's about people who honor our word. And I think going forward the next 50 years, we also need, particularly if we're going to have all those conversations, how can we be in the top right quadrant? And to be in the top right quadrant, we need to have an agreement among ourselves as a country. How are we going to maintain our wealth level? And how are we going to maintain, how are we going to spend the wealth in such a way that we can maintain the wealth level rather than drop into the bottom right quadrant? That requires people to honor each other. That requires people to honor each other in terms of, I'm listening to you, you listening to me. We have to figure this thing out because we are all in the same boat and working the way forward. So let me just close off there and say that honor and honoring each other, I think, to me, these are the most important things for the next 50 years. Thank you very much.